Did medieval women only sit in towers waiting for a hero? Were their lives nothing more than endless chores and quiet obedience in the centuries between 500 and 1500? Pop culture often paints a certain picture, but is it the real one? Number 9. The purely domestic woman. Pop culture often shows medieval women confined entirely to the home. Their days are filled with cooking over an open fire, sewing simple garments, and perhaps tending a small garden patch. The world outside their dwelling seems to be the exclusive domain of men. Grand feasts and movies might show women serving at the table, their roles limited to the kitchen and the nursery. Think of so many fantasy shows where the village women are just part of the background, bustling inside while men ride out for adventure or work in the fields. They rarely venture beyond the village common, and certainly never into the market or the wider world of commerce. Their hands are busy with domestic arts, their minds supposedly preoccupied with household management and children. This portrayal suggests a fundamental separation, a division of labor so absolute that women had no public or economic presence at all. They exist to support the male characters, their stories tied to the inside of a hovel or a castle chamber. Historical records, however, reveal a much more expansive reality for medieval women, particularly in the economic sphere. Women were vital, active participants in the economy across all social strata. In peasant communities, women worked alongside men in the fields, performing tasks such as planting, harvesting, and threshing. They managed livestock, brewed ale, made cheese, and spun wool into thread, often selling these products at local markets. Your court records from places like England and France detail women inheriting land, managing estates, and engaging in contracts. For example, women held land and tenements in their own right, and could even sue and be sued in court. Manorial records list women as tenants responsible for agricultural services and payments, just like men. In towns and cities, women were shopkeepers, artisans, and merchants. They ran taverns, bakeries, and butcher shops. Guild records from various European cities like London, Paris, and Cologne show women were members of craft guilds, often in their own right, not just as wives of male members. They worked as weavers, dyers, embroiderers, parchment makers, booksellers, and even armorers. Women often specialized in textile production, from processing raw wool to weaving elaborate tapestries. In Paris, a medieval document known as the Livre de Métiers Book of Trades, compiled by Etienne Boileau in the 13th century, lists numerous trades where women were actively involved, sometimes even dominating. The women were also active in the financial sector, lending money and managing accounts, particularly those widows who took over their husbands' businesses. Port records and customs documents show women engaging in long-distance trade, sometimes managing fleets of ships or extensive mercantile operations. For instance, Marjorie Kempe, an English mystic of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, was a successful businesswoman before she embarked on her spiritual journey. She ran a brewery and a horse mill, employing people and dealing with substantial financial transactions. Women owned and operated inns, providing lodging and meals for travelers. They were active in various service industries, from wet nursing to street selling. The poll tax returns from 14th century England, for example, reveal a broad range of occupations for women, indicating their pervasive presence in the workforce. Women were clearly not confined to purely domestic roles. Their work contributed significantly to the household income and the broader economy, often enabling families to survive and prosper. Their economic contributions were recognized, documented, and essential to the functioning of medieval society. Number 8. The uneducated, illiterate woman. Pop culture often presents medieval women as almost entirely unlearned, unable to read or write, confined to the realm of practical domesticity without access to books or formal education. Movies set in castles might show queens or noble women engaged in embroidery, but rarely with a book in hand or debating philosophy. The general image is one of pervasive illiteracy, especially for women outside the highest echelons of royalty. Female characters might be depicted as superstitious, easily swayed by local folklore, or relying on others for information rather than seeking knowledge themselves. Schools, when shown, are often exclusively male, and even for noble daughters, education is usually limited to courtly etiquette, basic arithmetic, and household management, not serious academic pursuits. The idea of a medieval woman deeply immersed in literature, history, or theological texts seems alien to these portrayals. Historical evidence paints a different picture, revealing that literacy and education among medieval women were far more common and diverse than often portrayed. While widespread formal schooling was not universal for either gender, many women across different social classes possessed varying degrees of literacy and actively engaged with written culture. For noble and royal women, education was often extensive and sophisticated. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine were renowned patrons of the arts and literature, speaking multiple languages and fostering a vibrant intellectual court. Christine de Pizan, a late medieval writer, is a prime example. She was a scholar and author, writing numerous works of prose and poetry, including the Book of the City of Ladies, a defense of women and their capabilities. Her education was extensive, built on her father's scholarly background, and she maintained a writing career that supported her family. Convents and nunneries were crucial centers of female learning. For women who entered religious life, education was a fundamental part of their existence. The nuns were taught to read and write Latin, the language of scholarship and liturgy. They copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, composed music, and wrote chronicles and theological treatises. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was a visionary, composer, philosopher, mystic, and polymath. She wrote extensively on theology, natural history, and medicine, and corresponded with emperors and popes. Hratsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote Latin dramas and poetry. These women were not exceptions, but examples of a broader tradition of female intellectual activity within religious institutions. Beyond the nobility and convents, urban women, particularly those involved in trade and commerce, often needed basic literacy for business purposes. Merchants' as wives frequently managed accounts, inventories, and correspondence. On records show women participating in legal transactions, which often required understanding written documents. Even women of lower social standing might acquire literacy through various means. Parish clerks, local priests, or even literate family members sometimes provided instruction. Private tutors were employed by wealthier families. The ability to read was also important for religious devotion, allowing women to engage directly with prayer books, psalters, and devotional texts. The widespread production of vernacular devotional literature, often commissioned by or intended for women, indicates a substantial female readership. Archaeological finds and inventories of personal possessions also provide clues. Private libraries, even modest ones, often included books owned by women. Wills sometimes list books as personal property bequeathed to daughters or female relatives. The existence of reading guides and educational materials for women, often focused on moral instruction, but also covering practical knowledge, further suggests that literacy was not uncommon. While the exact percentage of literate women varied greatly by region and time period, the idea that medieval women were universally uneducated and illiterate is a misleading oversimplification. Many women valued knowledge, pursued learning, and contributed to the intellectual and literary life of their time. Number 7, the lack of female artistic and intellectual contribution. And pop culture often shows medieval women in passive roles as muses or as the subjects of art, but rarely as its creators or intellectual forces behind it. When a beautiful tapestry or an illuminated manuscript appears in a film, the assumption is usually that it was made by men in a monastery or a male-dominated workshop. Music scores in period dramas are almost always attributed to male composers, and the intellectual debates or philosophical discussions are usually portrayed as male endeavors. The image is one where women's creativity is limited to simple crafts like spinning or basic weaving, or perhaps as part of the audience for performances rather than as originators of complex artistic works or profound thoughts. There is a sense that medieval women simply did not contribute significantly to the grand artistic, literary, or intellectual movements of their age. The historical reality, however, tells a compelling story of active and often profound female participation in medieval art, literature, and intellectual life. Women were not just passive recipients of culture, they were often its architects, patrons, and innovators. In the realm of visual arts, women were skilled artisans and illuminators. Convents were major centers for manuscript production, where nuns meticulously copied, decorated, and bound books. Nuns like Guda, a 12th century German nun, signed her name in an illuminated manuscript, showing her pride in her work. The exquisite quality of many medieval illuminations suggests highly trained hands, many of which belonged to women working in monastic scriptoria. Women also worked as embroiderers, creating elaborate textiles and vestments for churches and noble households. The Bayeux tapestry, while often associated with male artisans, is sometimes argued to have involved significant female input given the nature of the craft. In music, female composers and performers were active. Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned previously, composed a vast body of sacred music, including hymns, sequences, and a morality play with sung parts, which are still performed today. Her compositions are complex and innovative, reflecting her profound theological and poetic sensibilities. Many other anonymous chants and polyphonic pieces from convents likely had female composers. Women were also celebrated as singers and musicians in courts and households. Troubadours and troubadours, female troubadours in Occitan-speaking regions of southern France, composed and performed lyrical poetry and music. Beatrice de Dia, a troubadouress from the 12th century, is one of the most famous whose passionate love songs survive to this day. Intellectually, women engaged with philosophical, theological, and scientific ideas. Christine de Pizan, beyond her literary achievements, was a sharp social critic and political theorist. She challenged prevailing misogynistic views and advocated for women's education and rightful place in society in works like the Book of the City of Ladies. Her writings were not just popular, they sparked debates and influenced later thinkers. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English mystic, wrote Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English known to be written by a woman. Her theological insights into the nature of God's love and the suffering of Christ were profound and original. Bridget of Sweden, a 14th century mystic and saint, founded a religious order and wrote extensive spiritual revelations that influenced European religious thought. Women were also significant patrons of the arts and literature, commissioning lavish manuscripts, churches, and works of art. Queens, duchesses, and abbesses often had significant financial resources and used them to foster cultural production, thereby shaping the artistic and intellectual landscape of their time. Their patronage was crucial for supporting artists, writers, and scholars, enabling the creation of some of the most enduring medieval cultural treasures. These examples demonstrate that medieval women were not just consumers of culture, but were active, influential, and innovative creators and thinkers, whose contributions deeply enriched the artistic and intellectual tapestry of their age. Number 6. The constant witch hunt victim. Popular culture often portrays the medieval period as a time of pervasive witch hunts, where any woman who was old, eccentric, or simply outspoken risked being accused of witchcraft, tortured, and burned at the stake. Movies and television shows frequently depict scenes of villagers turning on a woman, labeling her a witch, and bringing her to a quick, brutal end. This image suggests that the fear of witchcraft was a constant, everyday threat for medieval women, and that accusations were rampant throughout the entire period, leading to widespread persecution and execution. The idea of witch becomes almost synonymous with woman in these portrayals, implying that any female behavior deviating from the norm could lead to a fiery death. Historical records provide a crucial corrective to this popular misconception, showing that the most intense and widespread witch hunts actually occurred much later than the medieval period. The earning times primarily took place during the early modern period, roughly from the late 15th century through the mid-18th century, with peak activity in the 16th and 17th centuries. The medieval period, spanning from the 5th to the 15th centuries, saw very few accusations and even fewer executions specifically for witchcraft, as it was later understood. Early medieval law codes and theological writings certainly acknowledged harmful magic, but it was generally seen as a form of heresy or pagan superstition, not a widespread demonic conspiracy involving pacts with the devil. During the medieval period, accusations of magic did occur, but they were typically handled differently. Practices considered magical, like casting spells or divining the future, were often treated as minor offenses, sometimes as heresy by the church, but rarely resulted in capital punishment. When magical practices were prosecuted, they were often linked to other crimes, such as poisoning or political conspiracy, rather than being standalone accusations of demonic witchcraft. For example, accusations against individuals for practicing magic were sometimes made in royal courts for political reasons, as seen in the case of Alice Kyteler in 14th century Ireland, but her case was an anomaly for the time and involved accusations far beyond simple folk magic. The systematic legal procedures for identifying, trying, and executing witches that define the early modern witch hunts, including the use of torture to extract confessions and the reliance on demonological treatises, were not developed or widespread in the medieval era. The concept of a witch as an individual who had made a pact with the devil to gain supernatural powers for evil purposes was a theological and legal construct that evolved slowly, solidifying after the medieval period ended. Treatises like the Malleus Maleficorum, The Witch's Hammer, a notorious guide for witch hunters, were published in 1487 at the very end of the medieval period and became influential later on. While popular folklore and local beliefs about magic, charms, and healing arts certainly existed in the medieval period, they were generally viewed differently from the organized diabolical witchcraft that fueled later persecutions. Communities might suspect individuals of causing harm through malevolent magic, but the legal and social mechanisms for mass persecution were not in place. The number of recorded executions for witchcraft in the medieval period across Europe is remarkably low compared to the thousands that occurred in the early modern period. This distinction is critical. The overwhelming majority of people executed for witchcraft were victims of a phenomenon that largely occurred after the medieval era had concluded. Therefore, portraying medieval women as constantly living under the shadow of a witch hunt is a significant historical inaccuracy. Number 5. The uniformly submissive woman. Pop culture frequently portrays medieval women as uniformly meek, passive, and utterly submissive to male authority, whether it be fathers, husbands, or religious figures. Female characters often speak only when spoken to, accept their arranged marriages without protest, and generally lack any discernible agency or strong opinions. They are seen as existing solely to fulfill societal expectations, their lives dictated by tradition and male dominance, with no room for personal desires, dissent, or independent thought. This stereotype suggests a complete absence of female power or influence, reducing women to silent figures in a patriarchal society where their voices are never heard and their wills are consistently bent. Even noblewomen are often depicted as graceful, silent ornaments, rather than individuals with political acumen or strong personalities. Historical records, however, reveal a far more complex and varied picture of medieval women, many of whom exerted significant influence, expressed strong opinions, and defied societal norms, sometimes quite openly. While the medieval world was indeed patriarchal, women found numerous ways to assert their agency and wield power, both within and outside traditional structures. In the highest echelons of society, queens and noblewomen often held substantial political power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women of the High Middle Ages, ruled vast territories in her own right, accompanied her husband on crusade, and actively participated in political intrigues and courtly life. Blanche of Castile, regent of France for her young son Louis IX, effectively governed the kingdom, suppressed baronial rebellions, and secured peace treaties. Matilda of Tuscany was a powerful countess who played a key role in the investiture controversy, supporting the Pope against the Holy Roman Emperor. These women were not just ceremonial figures, but active rulers and political strategists. Even outside the direct exercise of political power, women exerted influence. Abbesses of powerful convents managed vast estates, commanded large numbers of people, and held significant spiritual and sometimes temporal authority. Hilda of Whitby, a 7th century abbess, presided over a double monastery of monks and nuns and hosted the Synod of Whitby, a crucial church council. Her influence extended far beyond her abbey. Women in the lower classes also showed agency. Legal records, for instance, show women initiating lawsuits, defending their property rights, and engaging in contracts. They often managed households and businesses, making crucial decisions about finances and labor. Widows, in particular, often gained a greater degree of autonomy, as they could control their own dowries and inheritances and choose whether or not to remarry. Women also found ways to challenge norms and express their beliefs. Marjorie Kempe, mentioned earlier, defied societal expectations by leaving her family life to pursue a spiritual pilgrimage, a path that brought her into conflict with both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Her autobiography details her strong will, her vocal expressions of faith, and her persistent pursuit of her own spiritual path despite public skepticism and ridicule. Other women like Julian of Norwich offered powerful theological insights from their anchor holds, shaping spiritual discourse. Court records often reveal domestic disputes where women argued, complained, and sometimes even physically resisted their husbands, indicating that submission was not always absolute or unquestioned. While societal expectations leaned towards female submission, individual women often carved out spaces for agency, asserting their will, influencing decisions, and leading lives far removed from passive conformity. Their varied experiences show that the idea of uniformly submissive medieval women is a gross oversimplification. Number 4. The absence of female warriors or leaders. Pop culture often depicts medieval warfare and leadership as exclusively male domains. Knights, kings, commanders, and soldiers on the battlefield are almost always men. Women, if present in war narratives, are typically victims, nurses, or passive onlookers. There is a strong implication that women played no active role in military matters, political governance, or the strategic direction of kingdoms. When a queen appears, she is usually behind the scenes, her power either ceremonial or exercised through manipulation, never through direct command or presence on the front lines. The imagery consistently reinforces the idea that women simply did not lead armies, defend castles, or hold significant political office in a way that directly impacted the course of battles or the fate of nations. Historical accounts, however, provide compelling evidence of numerous medieval women who actively participated in warfare, led armies, governed territories, and held significant political power, often during times of conflict. These women were not mere exceptions, but notable figures whose actions shaped the course of history. One of the most famous examples is Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed divine guidance to lead the French army to several important victories against the English during the Hundred Years' War. She wore armor, carried a banner, and inspired soldiers, playing a direct and crucial role in military campaigns. Her leadership was recognized by both common soldiers and powerful nobles. Beyond Joan, many noble women and queens actively defended their castles and territories during sieges. When their husbands or fathers were away fighting, it was often the lady of the castle who organized its defense, rallied the garrison, and negotiated terms. For example, during the anarchy in England, 1135 to 1153, Empress Matilda led her forces in a prolonged civil war against Stephen for the English throne, demonstrating considerable military and political skill. Her mother-in-law, Matilda of Scotland, likewise held significant political sway. Isabel of France, Queen Consort of England, famously led an invasion of England with her lover Roger Mortimer to depose her husband, Edward II. She raised an army and successfully orchestrated a coup, establishing herself as regent for her son. Eleanor of Aquitaine, already mentioned for her political acumen, also accompanied her first husband, Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade. Although her direct military involvement is debated, her presence was politically significant. Women sometimes led naval forces, as seen with Jeanne de Clisson, also known as the Lioness of Brittany, who became a pirate and commanded a fleet of ships to wage war against the French king in the 14th century, seeking revenge for her husband's execution. Agnes Sorel, although not a direct warrior, was influential in the court of Charles VII of France and encouraged him to take back his kingdom from the English, playing a role in motivating the war effort. Many women served as regents for their young sons or absent husbands, effectively governing kingdoms and making crucial decisions about war and peace. These roles were not just nominal, they involved direct engagement with political strategy, diplomacy, and often the management of military forces. Queens like Margaret of Denmark, who united the three Scandinavian kingdoms under her rule in the late 14th century, effectively wielded power comparable to any king, making military alliances and directing policy. The idea that women were entirely absent from military leadership or political command in medieval Europe is a pervasive myth. Historical accounts frequently highlight women who were formidable leaders, strategists, and even warriors, defying the passive images often presented in modern media. Number 3, the lack of female agency and empowerment. Pop culture frequently portrays medieval women as completely lacking agency, their lives entirely dictated by men and societal structures. They are often depicted as pawns in political marriages, forced into convents, or subjected to their husband's absolute authority without any means of resistance or choice. The narrative often emphasizes their powerlessness, suggesting that women had no personal desires, ambitions, or means to shape their own destinies. Female characters might lament their fate, but rarely take decisive action to change it, reinforcing the idea that medieval women were entirely disempowered, unable to make significant decisions about their lives, bodies, or futures. Their stories are usually about enduring, not enacting change. Historical records, however, reveal numerous instances where medieval women demonstrated considerable agency and exercised power within various spheres of life, often challenging or navigating existing societal constraints. While formal legal and social structures were often patriarchal, women found diverse ways to exert influence and make choices that shaped their lives and the lives of those around them. And women had choices, even if those choices were sometimes limited by their social status or circumstances. For example, marriage was often arranged, particularly in noble circles, but women were not always passive recipients. Evidence exists of women refusing unsuitable matches, sometimes going to extraordinary lengths to avoid them, such as fleeing to convents or appealing to ecclesiastical courts. While such defiance was risky, it was not unheard of. Women could also choose to enter religious life, a path that offered intellectual pursuits, leadership roles, and a degree of autonomy not always available in secular marriage. Convents provided spaces where women could become scholars, artists, administrators, and spiritual guides, often with significant influence over their communities and beyond. These women made a conscious choice to dedicate their lives to God, and in doing so, often gained significant personal and communal power. For instance, abbesses could manage vast estates, command their own spiritual and sometimes secular dependence, and hold sway in regional politics. In economic life, women often displayed considerable agency. They owned property, managed businesses, and participated in trade, as discussed earlier. A woman could decide to run her deceased husband's business or start her own. Widows, in particular, often enjoyed greater legal and economic independence as they were no longer under the legal guardianship of a husband. They could inherit property, manage their dowries, and make decisions about their own finances and future, including whether or not to remarry. Some legal documents show women suing in court, acting as witnesses, and entering into contracts, all demonstrating their capacity to act independently within the legal system. Even within marriage, women were not always powerless. While husbands held legal authority, wives often managed the household, controlled domestic finances, and had significant influence over child rearing and social networks. Some marriage contracts included provisions to protect a woman's dowry or property, ensuring her economic security. Women also used social networks, kinship ties, and religious beliefs to exert influence and find support. Women often engaged in charitable work, patronage of the arts, and spiritual movements, demonstrating their agency in shaping religious and cultural life. The lives of medieval women were complex and varied, marked by challenges, but also by opportunities for personal choice, influence, and the exercise of agency in ways that are often overlooked in simplified popular portrayals. Number 2, the damsel in distress. Pop culture repeatedly casts medieval women as helpless damsels in distress, constantly in need of rescue by brave knights or heroic male figures. They are often locked in towers, held captive by villains, or threatened by monsters existing solely to be saved. Their primary role is to be beautiful and vulnerable, providing motivation for the male protagonist's adventures. This portrayal strips them of any strength, resourcefulness, or capacity for self-preservation. Even noble women or queens are depicted as fragile and delicate, unable to defend themselves or their interests, perpetually waiting for male intervention to resolve their predicaments. This image suggests that medieval women were inherently weak and passive, incapable of independent action when faced with danger or adversity. Historical sources, however, offer a much more nuanced and often robust view of medieval women, many of whom displayed remarkable resilience, strength, and active participation in their own survival and the defense of their communities. While the concept of courtly love and the chivalric ideal of protecting ladies certainly exists in literature, real women were often far from helpless. As discussed earlier, women frequently managed and defended castles during sieges, demonstrating considerable fortitude and strategic ability. They organized the garrison, oversaw provisions, and rallied the defenders. Their actions were crucial for the survival of their households and sometimes entire regions. They were not merely waiting inside for a rescue, they were actively leading the defense. Women also took active roles in economic life, which required strength, shrewdness, and resilience. Managing farms, running businesses, and participating in trade often involved significant physical labor and demanding negotiations. Women in peasant communities worked alongside men in the fields, enduring harsh conditions and contributing directly to the sustenance of their families. Now, urban women engaged in physically demanding trades, such as brewing, baking, and textile production. These were not activities for the faint of heart or the perpetually delicate. Beyond the physical, medieval women showed immense emotional and mental fortitude. They endured high rates of child mortality, often faced difficult childbirths, and navigated complex social and political landscapes. And many women, particularly those in lower social strata, had to be self-reliant and resourceful to survive. They often managed households, raised children, and contributed to the family income, all while dealing with the realities of life in a less technologically advanced society. Women also played vital roles in healing, nursing, and caring for the sick and elderly, often acting as the primary caregivers in their communities, a role requiring considerable strength and practical knowledge. Even in situations of personal danger or legal dispute, women often acted decisively. All records show women appealing to courts, fleeing abusive situations, or seeking protection through social networks. Some women took up arms, as seen with women participating in peasant revolts or defending their lands. While these were not necessarily common occurrences for every woman, they demonstrate that the capacity for self-defense and active resistance existed. The ideal of the damsel in distress was a literary trope that romanticized the role of women and knights, but it does not accurately reflect the practical realities of medieval women's lives. Many women were strong, resourceful, and capable individuals who actively contributed to their own safety and the well-being of their families and communities, rather than simply waiting for rescue. Number 1. The one-dimensional saint or sinner. Pop culture often pigeonholes medieval women into one of two extreme simplistic categories: the saintly, virginal, pure, and pious woman, or the wicked, seductive, manipulative, and sinful woman. There is rarely an in-between. Female characters are either angelic figures, devoid of complex desires or flaws, often destined for a chaste marriage or the convent, or they are presented as scheming temptresses, witches, or dangerous rebels. This binary portrayal denies medieval women their full humanity, reducing them to moral archetypes rather than complex individuals with varied personalities, motivations, and experiences. It implies that women were either inherently good or inherently evil, with no room for personal growth, moral ambiguity, or a nuanced blend of virtues and vices. Historical reality reveals that medieval women, like people in any era, were incredibly diverse and complex individuals, embodying a wide spectrum of human qualities, beliefs, and behaviors. Their lives were not neatly divided into these simplistic saint-sinner categories. Many women lived lives that defy easy categorization, showing a mix of piety and pragmatism, ambition and humility, conformity and rebellion. Take, for instance, women involved in trade or business. They could be pious members of their local church, yet also shrewd negotiators and fierce competitors in the marketplace. Their lives involved both spiritual devotion and practical economic endeavors, often simultaneously. Marjorie Kempe again offers a prime example of a woman who was neither purely a saint nor a simple sinner in the popular sense. She was deeply pious, experienced visions, and undertook extensive pilgrimages. Yet, she was also a businesswoman who failed, a mother and a woman who sometimes faced public scorn for her emotional displays and unconventional religious practices. And she was strong-willed, persistent, and certainly not a passive saintly figure. Her autobiography shows her as a complex character grappling with her faith, her family, and her place in society, not a one-dimensional archetype. Noblewomen, too, displayed a range of personalities and motivations. Queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, were patrons of art and literature, but also powerful political figures who engaged in intrigues, raised armies, and even went on crusade. Their lives were filled with political calculations, family dynamics, and personal ambitions, not just the pursuit of piety or manipulative schemes. Women in rural communities might be deeply superstitious or rely on folk medicine, yet also be devout churchgoers and pillars of their local community, contributing significantly to its well-being. Their beliefs and practices often blended formal religion with local traditions, making their spiritual lives far more complex than simple piety or outright heresy. Moreover, medieval legal and social records reveal women engaging in all manner of human activities, from petty disputes and criminal acts to acts of profound charity and intellectual scholarship. Women appeared in court as plaintiffs and defendants, engaged in gossip and feuds, formed strong friendships, raised families, and pursued personal interests. They loved and lost, made good decisions and bad ones, just like anyone else. The nuanced reality of medieval women's lives encompasses a spectrum of human experience that is frequently flattened into stark moral binaries by popular media. Their stories are far richer and more compelling when viewed through the lens of their full humanity, rather than through the narrow definitions of saint or sinner.